Welcome to the HiRSE Summer of AI for RSE. If you want to learn more on how AI is changing the way we write and work with research software, this collection of episodes is for you.
Hi, I'm Florence. I'm a research software engineer at Aalto University in Finland, and I'm really happy to be here. In this episode, I want to look at the challenges that AI-generated pull requests are creating for open source communities and how those communities are starting to respond with a particular focus on AI contribution policies. I had a lot of fun putting this presentation together, and I hope you will enjoy it too. I got interested in this topic because of experiences in my own work. So, contributing to open source software is a regular part of my job. And it was in that context that I recently started coming across more and more AI generated pull requests. And that kind of got me thinking, how am I actually supposed to handle these? And it turned out that this was just in my mind, but also a question that colleagues have. And also, a quick look at the broader conversation makes clear this isn't an isolated problem, but affecting entire communities. So that's exactly why I wanted to use this opportunity as part of the AI for RSE series to dig into the topic a bit deeper and to try to understand where things stand right now, how we got here, and what we can actually do about it. This presentation has three parts. First, I briefly cover what open source communities actually are and what it means to contribute to open source software. Then I share some thoughts on how AI is changing contribution dynamics and why that's becoming a real challenge for these communities. And finally, I walk you through some example AI contribution policies from different communities. So let's start with some general thoughts on open source communities. For the purpose of this talk, I think of an open source community as a group of people who form around a piece of software which they create, use, discuss, improve, and maintain. And the key point here is that open source isn't just about publishing code in a repository, but it's really about how people organize around that code, the social interactions, the relationships, and the shared norms. When someone wants to contribute to code to an open source project, the typical workflow looks as follows. First, the contributor needs to understand the project's conventions and rules, which might look actually very different from different projects. After that, they download the code, set up the project locally, and make sure they can run it. Then they need to understand the relevant part of the code base, and then they make a change and submit this change to the project. Now, the platform that most people use for this kind of workflow is GitHub nowadays. On GitHub, you can find projects with their code repositories and information about contribution guidelines. When you want to change something in the code base, you download the code base by cloning or forking the repository. Then you make your change locally. And when you want to submit then your change to the project, you do this usually by opening a pull request or a short PR. So that's where the name in the title of this presentation comes from. Once a change has been proposed, the review process begins. So someone has to read and understand the proposed change, check whether it actually works, and assess whether it fits the project. Sometimes this review can actually be very quick, but often it takes many rounds before the change is either ready to merge or clearly needs to be rejected. And this review phase is essentially the bottleneck of the entire contribution workflow, simply because it takes time and requires the reviewer's attention. And this attention is a limited resource. Most open source communities have many users who use the software but may never directly contribute. Many casual contributors who contribute once or only every now and then, a smaller group of regular contributors, and only a handful of maintainers who lead the project, review and merge pull requests, and shape the direction of the software. This kind of uneven distribution is very common in open source. so that a small number of people end up kind of doing most of the work, while the majority interact only occasionally. And this also means that the whole system only works when contributions are regulated in some way. Before platforms like GitHub came along, contributing to an open source project was much less standardized. And that actually created a kind of natural self selection process. So the barriers were high enough that they regulated how many contributions a project received, and in turn, how many interactions a maintainer had to deal with. When platforms like GitHub were introduced, contributing became much easier and more accessible, and thus more people started to participate. The flip side is that already then maintainers were raising concerns that they have to deal with a much larger number of interactions now, whereby not only the number of contributions increased, but also the variance in their quality. The introduction of AI assistants and agents has further lowered the barrier to contributing to open source software and increasing then consequently both the volume and the variance in quality of pull requests. But what actually are the challenges that open source communities face with AI generated pull requests? First, with AI tools, people can now automate large parts of the contribution workflow and generate entire pull requests within seconds. And when that possibility gets misused, when pull requests are submitted without any prior verification, the effort of actually checking the code gets completely offloaded onto the reviewer. They now have to invest significant time going through a PR that the contributor barely looked at, and that time is taken away from everything else they could be doing for the project. In that sense, these kinds of contributions can become extractive. An extractive contribution is one where the cost of reviewing and merging it outweighs the benefit to the project. Or to put it more simply, some pull requests are just more effort than they are worth. A pull request can look like free work on the surface, but if it requires a maintainer to spend hours trying to understand it, correct it, and discuss it, it may not actually be helping the project at all. Another challenge with AI generated pull requests is that they demand a different way of reviewing. Traditionally, a low quality pull request was fairly easy to spot. Bad description, forgotten edge cases, copy paste errors, missing tests, inconsistent variable names. These things stood out quickly, and the reviewer could make a judgment call early on. But AI changes this. The problem is that AI generated pull requests often have a very high surface plausibility. At first glance, they look clean and well structured, but the real issues then only reveal themselves once you go through the code line by line. And that's exactly what makes them so tricky to review. On top of that, AI generated pull requests tend to fail in ways that human contributors simply don't. Like, just to give you a few examples, often AI modifies files it was never supposed to touch, actually. Then the scope of PRs increases, so it produces very long pull requests that take much longer to get through. Then also, when there is actually uncertainty in the implementation, human contributor usually flexes by putting comments on the code or asking questions, but an AI will just produce confidently wrong code. And another problem which we often have with AI-generated pull requests are hallucination errors. That is, for example, libraries or datasets are imported that actually don't exist, and this is very easy to miss on a first pass. So this is really something you only realize when you run the code and go through it line by line. And finally, there is another problem with AI-generated pull requests, namely their impact on trust. In my experience, open source communities are often very welcoming places. There's real culture of mentoring newcomers, helping them grow, and hopefully seeing them become active contributors over time. And that relationship is built through discussion, feedback, and revision, so through human interaction. But when a maintainer is increasingly faced with low-quality AI-generated PRs that demand a lot of review effort, it becomes a frustrating experience. And it gets particularly frustrating when the maintainer provides careful, detailed feedback and the contributor just responds with another AI-generated answer. When there is no meaningful human interaction anymore, trust simply stops forming. And I think this is a serious problem because, as I mentioned at the very beginning, social relationships are a core part of what open source communities actually are. And those relationships depend on trust. This new situation has triggered internal discussions across open source communities and the development of AI contribution policies. Communities have to decide for themselves now where they stand, where they want to stand, what kind of contributions they want to encourage, what they consider acceptable, and in general, what values they want to uphold. And this is exactly where an AI contribution policy steps in. It makes those expectations explicit. It gives contributors clear guidelines, and it gives maintainers a shared basis for accepting, questioning, or rejecting contributions. In the following, I'd like to look at a few examples of AI contribution policies and see how different open source communities are actually responding to this challenge. The first example is STEN, an open source project on applied Bayesian statistics. And this example comes relatively naturally as I'm part of this community. And I was actually also involved in the development of this policy. And we introduced it in May of this year. So it's quite recent. STEN is a relatively small to mid-size open source community and also quite specialized with a focus on Bayesian statistics. And so far, we've been lucky in that most of our contributors use AI assistance responsibly. And that's also reflected in the position we've taken. So AI-assisted contributions are, in general, welcome. However, the central condition is that every contribution must remain the work of an accountable human, and every pull request has to be submitted by a named individual who takes responsibility for it. And we do not accept fully automated or agentic submissions. We also require disclosure. When a pull request is submitted, the contributor needs to state whether AI was used or not so that we can calibrate our review process accordingly. And if AI assistance was used, we essentially ask the contributor to affirm they reviewed the code, understood it, and can explain and defend the changes during review. The second example is the Carpentries, which is an open source community that provides teaching sessions and material about foundational coding and data science skills to researchers. And they also introduced only recently their AI contribution policy. Similarly to STAN, contributors are required to acknowledge the use of an LLM when submitting a pull request by adding, for example, an assisted by statement to their contribution. However, raw and unreviewed LLM output is not accepted. The output has to be reviewed and verified before submission. So again, fully automated contributions are off the table. There's also a really interesting additional requirement, namely the issue text, comments, and pull request description must be written by the human contributors themselves. And this is something I really like because it forces the contributor to articulate their own mental model, which is an essential part of actually understanding the change. And it helps the reviewer enormously because they get a much clearer picture of the context and intent behind the contribution. And finally, there is a notable exception, namely AI-generated contributions to issues labeled as good first issue are explicitly rejected. And the reason is actually relatively straightforward because those issues exist to help newcomers get into open source contributing, and that learning process shouldn't be shortcut by just handing the task to an LLM. And there is one more thing about the Carpentries policy that I really like. They provide maintainers with a ready-made boilerplate response when they have to close a contribution that violates the AI contribution policy. So that's really helpful because then maintainers don't have to figure out how to word that conversations themselves, but that there is basically already this template. And they have also introduced an extractive tag, which can be applied to contributions that demand too much maintainer effort relative to their value. And yeah, this is now directly connected also to the concept we talked about earlier. The fourth example is Ghostty, an open source project that provides a terminal emulator. And they introduced their AI contribution policy at the beginning of this year. Similarly to the previous examples, contributors are required to disclose the use of AI. And Ghostty goes a step further. So they ask the contributors also to specify which tools they use and describes the extent to which the work was AI assisted. They, of course, also have a strong emphasis on understanding and similar, like in the Carpentries, the text written by an AI should be adapted to the contributor's own words. What is special in Ghosty's case is the introduction of a denouncement list. That is, contributors who submit clearly low quality AI generated code may be added to a public list and actually blocked from making future contributions. And this list blocked users are shown via a minus before the username. And the other usernames that you see here are actually vouched. This is another very interesting system that Ghosty introduced. Namely, as a first-time contributor, you can not just open a pull request or issue. Instead, you have to go through this kind of a voucher system in which you introduce yourself, explain what you want to change, and only once you've been approved, you can actually contribute. And I find this also very interesting because it's kind of bringing back basic social norms, such as, well, when I start to contribute to a new community, then the first thing what I do is I introduce myself. And by this, you try to build kind of like, these trusted relationships. And the final example is Zig, an open source project that develops a general purpose programming language. And they take a strict no LLM and no AI policy. The reasoning is explained in more detail in a blog post. Here is just a short extract from this longer blog post. Zig's experience with LLM-based contributions was rather negative. For example, they had a lot of PRs which had hallucinations or first-time contributions which were extremely long, or also PRs that simply looked clean on the surface, but in the moment when you start reviewing it and get in a discussion with the contributor, it was then revealed basically that the contributor just prompted an LLM in the background. And as a consequence, they say, well, we acknowledge that AI can be used in a responsible way, but given that we have a contributor base which does not use AI versus a contributor base that use AI, then why taking this risk into account that we also consider AI as a potential part of our user base. So then we can just focus on the people that don't use AI, and then we don't have any risk factor that we include here. And so the consequence is therefore then to have this strict no AI policy. And I can see is that different communities approach the situation of AI-generated pull requests in different ways, which makes totally sense. And as a result, there is no one-size-fits-all AI contribution policy. So this is really something each community has to work out for themselves. However, even though these policies take different position, I think they share a common mindset. So first of all, they all agree that AI cannot be accountable a contributor, and there must be always a human who understands and takes responsibility for the contribution. Then second, they all make clear that we need to be respectful of each other and in particular protect the time and effort of reviewers. And finally, they all try to maintain trust in the relationships between contributors. So while some communities allow AI assistance as long as a contributor is transparent and accountable, others draw kind of a clear line between trusted maintainers and outside contributors. And some go even further and now exclude AI entirely, as it creates uncertainty in this trust relationship. I would like to close this presentation with a few final thoughts that I'm taking away from working on this topic. First, and this might sounds pretty obvious, but I've realized the importance of basic social norms and human interactions in open source development. So when I think about open source, I tend to focus on technical skills like software design, version control, maintainability. But working on this really made me step back and realize that at its core, open source is about a group of people coming together to build something. And consequently, social relationships are central, and things like trust and mutual respect are just as important as any technical skill. Second, I found it interesting to realize that open source communities are, by their very nature, quite fragile, with most of the work being carried out by only a few people. But this also means that when new tools are introduced that shift the contribution dynamic, the mechanisms that regulate how people contribute need to be adapted as well. And what I found particularly interesting is that this is actually not a new problem. Like, for example, when GitHub was introduced, reviewers were already raising concerns about the quality and quantity of contributions. And now with the rise of AI, generated pull request, this is basically just the latest tool to change things, but with an even stronger impact on the contribution dynamic, such that communities can actually no longer ignore the fact and need to actively address it. And we can see that a first step towards such a regulating mechanism is for a community to understand what their common values are, what they want to stand for, and to bring this into a formal form, which is what we see reflected in the AI contribution policies that are emerging across different open source projects. However, this can, of course, only be a first step. We now need to think about more concrete tools that can help enforce these shared values. And this should not only be responsibility of open source communities themselves, but also of platforms such as GitHub, GitLab, Codebug, and so on. And finally, I want to leave you with a thought about how we evaluate contributor performance. Well, when we see hundreds of AI-generated pull requests spread across just as many projects, we have to ask ourselves, is this really about learning and growing and supporting a community? Or is it simply about optimizing a number on one's own profile? And I think as long as we kind of rewrite quantity over real contribution, we are just encouraging the wrong behavior. So perhaps alongside everything else discussed in this presentation, we might want to rethink how we evaluate contribution in open source software development. So that's it from my side. Thank you very much for having me. And yeah.
Thank you for watching this episode. Please check out the slides on Zenodo linked below and see you next time.